Have you ever wondered what the jhanas are? Maybe you've heard the term and aren't sure, or maybe you've had experience with the jhanas and you aren't sure why there's so much conflict or argument. In this video, we're going to be talking about that with an expert meditation teacher named Michael Taft. Welcome to the Deep Mindfulness Collective. My name is Janusz, and this is a live recording that we made during the Joy of Being a Live stream, our live streaming stream that occurs every Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday at 11 a.m. Eastern on this channel. In this series, we're going to be talking about the jhanas, what they are, what they mean, and disambiguation. And along with that, we're going to create a set of guided meditations, which we're going to include on Michael's channel. So make sure below, click the link to Michael's channel, hit the subscribe button and the bell icon so you can know when those guided meditations come out. And the series will be whole, having the pieces all together married in that way. Also, if you want to jump to any of the particular questions in the video, the time codes are listed below. This video is going to be part one of an extended series talking about jhana, what they are, what they mean, the different ways of approaching them, and how they can be used to develop our meditation practice, and getting rid of some of those myths. One note before we begin is that because of a number of technical challenges of the live stream, my microphone was actually doubled as it was going into the computer, so it's double loud that Michael's was, so it's crackling a little bit. We've brought it down enough that it's listenable, but just know that the sound is not where I'd like it to be, and I really would like the sound to be good, but we apologize for that. Also, because the sound was so loud, you can hear me in the background when Michael's talking, sometimes even breathing or that kind of thing, which drives me crazy, so thank you so much for your patience with that. It won't ever happen again. Have fun and let us know what you think below. Welcome to the Joy of Being a Live stream. This is the place where we explore the deep side of meditations, and we don't just explore it, we actually do it. So we're about to be joined by the very special, the very lovely Michael Taft. Michael Taft is a maverick meditation teacher, best-selling author, podcaster, and neuroscience junkie. He's got a problem. And of course, bigger than all of these, topping them all, Michael has a YouTube channel. If you haven't checked it out yet, do it. This is the crowning jewel of his career, is this beautiful YouTube channel that we're happy to have folks connect with. So let's bring our favorite guest in today. Here we go. Here's our friend Michael Taft. Michael, welcome.
Hey, thanks, Janusz. I'm so pleased that you took the time to memorize that biography and were able to make it through that 3 paragraphs of text so well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So welcome.
I deeply appreciate all your efforts to make this live stream come together. I know you've been killing yourself this morning to make all the technological pieces fall into place. How was your practice hanging with all the chaos?
Oh, it's good. I mean, it's so good. I mean, there's so much happening right now. We're having a lot of fun. We have this, I don't know if you know, we have this big lawsuit around our home, which we're trying to keep our loft in New York, which is like, it's all comical to me, you know. And then we have the wedding coming up really soon, which is exciting and fun. And nice. We got an email from my friend Daniel Ingram, and he can't come, but he wrote a beautiful poem, which was like the sweetest thing in the world. It was about like a food processor is like, you know, it's like it deconstructs food, and he went on this whole tirade about, you know, how that relates to deconstruction process and me, or, you know, etc. It's very cute, very beautiful. So it's been good. Things are very good.
He's an awesome guy. Yeah, I'm so excited for your wedding. I hope you guys have a wonderful wedding.
Yeah, we're pretty excited too.
Where are you planning on going?
For the wedding, we're doing it at Vassar College at the chapel there, because that's where Raquel went.
My friend Rick Jarrow is the religions professor, one of the religions professor at Vassar.
Oh, lovely.
So I've actually taught a lot of Vassar religions classes. So.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah. I've done a retreat there once, but that's aside from that.
Anyway, so let's talk about jhanas.
Let's do it. Let's do it. So, okay. So just to be clear, jhanas are the one true path. We all know that. It's the only way to get enlightenment. It's in there, and there's only one way to look at the jhanas, right? This is all correct?
That is 100% true, Janusz. And I'm just going to say that, you know, if you don't know how to do the jhanas, you might as well give up and go home, because they're the one true path. Yeah. So this is what.
If anyone doesn't know, we're kidding.
Yes. In fact, we are kidding. Basically, jhanas are a super fascinating topic, but they can be, in a way, sometimes overly emphasized by certain traditions. So that's why we're kidding about. But I want to just back up before we do anything like that and talk about Siddhartha Gautama, right, the historical Buddha. And we have an interesting moment in the Buddha's life where he had studied with his Brahminical teachers, and who had taught him meditation. He went to two different guys. He learned a bunch of really intense Brahminical type meditations. He decided that wasn't for him, even though he mastered those. Then he did I think it was 5 years of ascetical practices, basically starvation practice, trying to have equanimity with extreme pain. And at the end of that, he was just done, right? He's like, none of this works. I can't figure this out. I'm not actually liberated. What am I going to do? And it's just this cool moment of giving up and just sort of opening to creativity. And he remembered something from his childhood. This is kind of, I don't know, it's sort of poignant and a little bit just beautiful in a way. He just thought about being a child. And when he was a child, his dad was busy doing something, and the child, Siddhartha, sat on the banks of a river under a tree, and we know scripturally even what kind of tree it is. It's a rose apple tree. And he sat under the tree, and he remembered sitting under this tree, and as something like a young teen, maybe he's 11 or 12 or something, he sat on the bank of the river under a rose apple tree, and he went into an absorption, just because the river and the light on the river and the tree, it was just a beautiful moment of peaceful, relaxed absorption. And he remembered that state. And he just had this creative insight. He was like, that's it. That's the way I'm going to do this awakening thing. And so that's when he sat down, famously under the Bodhi tree, and started, his path to awakening. But that state that he remembered is an absorption state, right? And this kind of absorption state is what in the Buddha's time was called a jhana. So in kind of the Buddha's origin story, if we think of the Buddha as a spiritual superhero, he has a superhero origin story, and it's this memory of his childhood moment sitting on the riverbank going into this absorption. Okay, that becomes his way into awakening. Now, the awakening itself happens because of vipassana, but the kind of path in is through doing jhana. So it's a beautiful story, and it tells us a lot about what jhanas are, how they work, how to do them, and all that.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the questions I was going to ask you, is that there's this relationship between the Buddha recognizing that moment when he was a child and realizing that these kind of absorption states were helpful, and also, in a sense, recognizing that they weren't enough, that there had to be some other piece there to get him across the line.
Yes, and I know you're very concerned that people are going to get too focused on the jhanas, but I won't let that happen, Janusz. So
no, I'm not that. That's less of my concern. I just want people to have the context, because is mainly what it is I just, there's all these arguments that are sort of ridiculous, and it's just, you're always like, the context.
Yes, and the arguments are there for, they are ridiculous, and they're never-ending, and they're ongoing, and at the same time, they're there for an interesting reason, which we'll talk about as we go along.
Great.
But yes, there's even controversy, and interesting controversy, about whether you can achieve awakening through deep jhana. That is, in fact, a big point that we can get into. But let's talk about what an absorption is. Not a jhana, just any absorption, okay? if we use that word absorption, what would that mean to a normal English speaker? I was really absorbed in that TV show. I was really absorbed in a book or whatever, right? You get extremely concentrated. And absorption kind of points to deep concentration.
Right.
And that is, of course, part of what a jhana is. It's a very, very concentrated state. We would talk about absorptions in modern, Western culture in terms of flow states. And jhanas are, in fact, a kind of flow state. If people aren't familiar with flow state, not Shinzen-style flow, but psychology-style flow via Csikszentmihalyi, the Hungarian psychologist Csikszentmihalyi. His actual name is Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, and I'm slaughtering it because Hungarian is hard to say. But my wife, who speaks Hungarian fluently, says that's close enough for a white boy. So I'll do my best. But anyway, flow states are really interesting psychological states of absorption, right? And one of the features of a flow state is that you are fully engaged in an activity. It's pleasurable. You're doing the activity for its own sake. And eventually they have this great term, autocatalytic, where it kind of the activity starts doing itself, and it starts to just narrow and narrow and narrow attention till the entire field of awareness is absorbed in that activity, right? So that's a flow state. It can happen with sports. It can happen with, rock climbing. It can happen with playing chess. It can happen with art or music or whatever. That's a flow state. It's an absorption, right? And if you've ever been in a flow state, it's amazing. At the deepest level of flow state psychology, they recognize that the mind becomes so absorbed in the activity that the sense of self drops away. Right? And so there's this interesting flavor of the activity doing itself with no doer at all, right? So that's an absorption. It can happen with anything. And it's very related to jhana, but it's not exactly jhana. And that's only because jhana has a couple other definitional features. One is that it has to be wholesome. The topic has to be something wholesome. Because you can go into an absorption on how much you hate somebody, right? People get really obsessed about something they're really angry about, and they can we all know people who become so obsessed with something they're angry about that it becomes a kind of absorption for them. They're fully engaged in it. Well, that's not a jhana because, it's not a positive or wholesome subject. Jhanas have to be about nice things. This is why I was saying that the Buddha story under the rose apple tree is instructive, because it was this beautiful, pleasant, joyous moment. And for something to be a jhana, it does have to be on wholesome activities.
Yeah, and this sort of gets to this idea that people talk about around these horrible, dictators or something, that they have this ability to completely be engrossed in this experience and be, as though there was no self there. And sports players and people say, yeah, I'm doing meditation, etc. How those two relate to meditation is often, it's an underlying layer, but not the real meat and potatoes is what you're saying.
Yeah, and I mean, getting absorbed in sports or whatever is cool, right? That can be really pleasant and positive and maybe joyous, but it wouldn't have to be. So there's this possibility of absorptions that are basically really negative, And so I just want to point out that a jhana is wholesome. That's number one. That's what makes it different than a flow state, is just that it's a little narrower of a definition, a flow state on something positive. A second thing is that a jhana has to be, it has to contain jhana factors. And so this is part of the interesting thing about jhanas, is that they are about certain qualities in meditation, not about certain depths. And this is going to, this is where we get the jhana wars, is the difference between qualities of meditation and depths of meditation. So number one, it's got to be about a wholesome thing. Number two, it's got these jhana factors, which we'll talk about. And then number three is a really kind of tautological part, which is it takes place during meditation, right? The context is meditation. It's not playing sports or whatever.
Right.
And the word jhana, just because you're all shinheads, and I'm a shinhead, and part of why I'm a shinhead is that I love etymologies and so on. What does the word jhana even mean? Well, if we go etymologically, it's from a verb jhayati, which in Pali, which means to think or just to meditate. And there's this one etymological possibility that it's related to a verb jhapati, which means to burn up. And that's the probable direction of the verb, is that you're burning away everything that's not part of the jhana.
And there's this interesting linguistic correlation between jhana as this fire and nibbana as this quenching, this sort of quenching of a flame and quenching that's completely satisfying. This is like kind of a fascinating relationship there.
Well, yeah, Janusz, and if you spend much time with Indian religion or Indo-Iranian religion, right? The Aryans are Indo-Iranian. What do you get? It's a fire metaphor through and through. In Zoroastrianism, they still have fire temples, and Ahura Mazda is about fire, right? And when you look at the Brahmins, so remember the Buddha learned to meditate from Brahmins, the whole Brahminical practice is the fire ceremony. And then every metaphor of Brahminical practice is about the fire burning up the impurities, or the fire taking the offering. So the fact that the Buddhism uses these two verbs, nibbana, to put out the fire, jhapati or jhana to, burn away impurities, it's all part of this Indo-Iranian fire thing. It's very, very cool. And just to kind of put the cap on it, it's funny, this verb jhana in Sanskrit becomes dhyana, but when you pronounce Sanskrit in the Hindi way, it's dhyan. When this Sanskrit verb dhyana or dhyan comes to China, they just transliterate it. So Bodhidharma comes to China, but even before Bodhidharma, Buddhism comes to China. They translate the word dhyana as chana. Chana, it's just, they're just trying to say the Sanskrit word. And then when they shorten it, like dhyana in Sanskrit becomes jhana, chana becomes chan, and Chan Buddhism is what we call Zen. So Zen is just the word jhana, right? Which is really fascinating, since Zen practice and jhana practice are very different. But you have to realize, and this is the whole reason I'm going into this etymology, is there's two meanings of jhana. One is just generally to meditate at all, and the other is these special meditations or these special absorptions. So this leads to a lot of confusion if you don't realize the word has these two different meanings.
That's great. And I want to jump back to something you said a minute ago about the fire metaphor. Does this mean we're basically all worshippers of the god of light? Is that what I'm seeing here?
The fire witch is going to, jump out at a retreat at any time. Exactly.
Exactly.
The Lord of Light.
Exactly.
We're all going to get resurrected.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating. I having spent so much time in Hindu practice and in India and really doing actual fire ceremonies and stuff, watching all that in the Game of Thrones with the fire religion is really fascinating, because of course it's nothing like that, the Game of Thrones fire religion, but the metaphor is obvious.
Yeah, and there's that the new popularity of candle flame practice, which is being interestingly, as you know, developed now. When we were at the retreat with Daniel, it's like they're making up the technology to some degree. It's very, very old, and they're trying to figure out, like, how do we talk about this in a kind of contemporary way? But I'm sure you have a lot of experience with the more ancient relationship there and how that relates to this material.
Well, candle flame meditation is kasina meditation, right? It's fire kasina. And actually, you can do kasinas of any of the elements. But you're getting way off topic into something that's so fascinating. No, it's really, really interesting because Brahminical meditation, the idea is you're not just going to deconstruct yourself, you're going to deconstruct self and world, but you're going to do that elementally. So the world was, the elements come to cohere, the elements cohere into the world and all that. So in Brahminical meditation, you're taking apart the elements one by one back to some primordial state. And so in Buddhism, that's maintained in these kasina practices, fire kasina, water kasina, and so on. And what do you do with kasina practice? Jhanas, right? That's what the kasinas are for. So in fire kasina, you're getting a nimitta and doing an absorption on that nimitta, etc.
And just so folks know, when you're talking about Brahminical practice, you're talking about the practices that led up to the Buddha's awakening, that were the older practices that Hinduism is heavily based on. Is that about right?
That's correct. I mean, in a really jargony way, I would say the Hindu practices, but of course, Hinduism is a modern invention. It's really Brahminical or Upanishadic practices. Right? So
Got it.
It's pre-Hinduism. Anyway, that topic gets super fascinating. It's historical, it's linguistic, it's meditation, it's philosophical, it's religious. It just goes deep, 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 deep. But yes, fire kasina practice is one of the elemental kasinas, right? And kasinas were developed in later Buddhism, but they were found to be a cool way to go into jhana. And this is what I want to say, even though jhanas are just a special kind of flow state with a narrowing of the definition to make sure they're wholesome and meditative and they have these jhana factors, once you've got that definition, you can go into a jhana on anything. It can be the breath, it can be body sensation, but it can be anything. It can be looking at water like the Buddha did, he's looking at a river when he went into jhana. I certainly have had the experience, and people do this in Dzogchen and stuff. You, for example, stare at the sky and in a very open awareness kind of way, and you can go into quite a deep absorption just with sky kasina. So any object, as long as it's a wholesome object and fits the definition, but within that wide range, you can go into jhana on anything. So that's important to realize, because people are always saying it must be the breath, or it must be this, or it must be that. Well, actually, no. You can go into jhana on a very, very, very wide variety of objects. So you're getting the picture that the idea is we're going to pick some object and go into an absorption on it, right? Which is essentially a very high state of concentration. But the jhanas are a little more clearly defined than that. That's why instead of just saying jhana, in English, we're always calling them the jhanas, because they're really specific in terms of their characteristics. Although there's a lot of controversy about that too. What the specific characteristics mean and stuff. It's not just high concentration, it's high concentration in a particular way. So I'll just pause there for a second.
Great. And we're getting a bunch of questions in from the chat, so thank you folks for giving those. Because it's moving by a little bit quickly, I guess we should wait for some of the Q&A section, because they're getting pretty dense as far as, could you practice the jhanas solely in the system, Unified Mindfulness System, which is one of the central lineages that both Michael and I trained in. And you and I were talking about just yesterday, you were mentioning that Shinzen generally is sort of training people towards what you would describe as fourth jhana, which I think we'll probably get into over time. But right for now, folks, maybe hold questions, maybe note your own question, and then we'll hold it for now, and then we'll jump in. If you want a question at any point, Michael, we'll just go through and grab one for you.
Okay. And the thing you just said about fourth jhana, that's highly qualified. And so we're just going to imagine Janusz didn't say that, because the explanation of what that means takes like a half an hour.
Yeah, no qualifications. This is the way it is. If you don't listen to Michael, you're never going to be happy in your life. Forget even awakening. You're just going to be miserable.
And listening to me might make you miserable also. So, no guarantees. Okay, so we've kind of got this wide picture of jhana, and that there is jhana, which can just be meditation, any meditation. But then there's the jhanas, which have this very specific definition. And a thing I want to harken back to is that jhanas are about qualities, not about depth. And so that's where we get a lot of confusion, because it's possible to get into a very light jhana pretty easily, as long as you recognize a flow state. However, the deepest jhanas are ones that people came up with in multi-year silent retreats, and it takes that kind of hyper seclusion and focus to go into these extremely deep jhanas. However, that's the depth dimension. So let's go back to the qualities dimension. So what does it mean? How do you get into a jhana? What is it for? Let's start out with what is it for? Basically, if you wanted to say what are jhanas good for, you could say a couple things. One would be they're really pleasurable. Number one, they can get you really very engaged and excited and happy about your meditation practice, because they just feel so good to do. And so it's a great way to get people going on meditation. If they get to the place of being able to get even into a very light jhana, they're going to like it a lot. So that's number one. Remember, they're wholesome, they're pleasant, they have these factors of pleasantness. So they feel good. Another thing is that once you get going on jhanas and you're trying to work on them, it's building your concentration up to a very high degree. We could say that jhanas, when you start getting really absorbed, this is like the pinnacle of human concentration, especially the deep jhanas. But even a light jhana is, compared to your regular meditation, probably, let's say whatever meditation level you're at, if you can go into a jhana, then at that level, you're very concentrated. So that's another great thing. And don't worry, I'll put the disclaimers in there, Janusz, so no fear. So they feel good, you get highly concentrated, and then the third thing I would say is that, and this becomes a really major factor, is that they're really good for purification. Sometimes purification in regular Vipassana is like chewing rocks. It works, but it can be really difficult, right? It's unpleasant. I've done quite a bit of Vipassana purification, and that once you get the taste of purification, as Shinzen's always saying, that it's very delicious in a way, but it's also hard. And the jhanas are a way to work through some of that purification in a way that's somewhat less painful. So guys like Daniel Ingram would say that the jhanas give you an opportunity to kind of skirt around some of the more difficult traumas and stuff people can have in their bodies. So that's a debatable point, but it's interesting.
And I wanted to actually ask, because something that comes up recently, there's a glowing popularity right now around Chula Das's book, which is excellent, has a lot of great material in there, and there can be a tendency where people will talk about that if you do it in any particular way, that you will be free of any difficult material as you move through the path, or not free, but that basically dark night might not happen at all. And I'm curious if that relates to what you're saying, or if this is we're talking about a different stage.
No, that's the same point. I mean, I doubt anyone cannot have a dark night at all. Maybe it's a long, dark tea time of the soul. As Douglas Adams said, I don't know. But you got to work through the material one way or another. But Tuladasa would claim, and by the way, that book, The Mind Illuminated, get it, read it, memorize it. Even if you don't do those practices as theory, it is amazing. It is a wonderful, wonderful book. It's a masterpiece, I would say. But and he explains the jhanas to the nth degree in there as just a sidelight. But anyway, yes, it can really help with working through difficult material, for sure. On the other hand, some people are better at jhanas than others. Some people, just for whatever reason, go into jhanas more easily. And some people do Vipassana more easily. So you might not be as prone to, going into a jhana easily. And so it's not like you have to do this. And so I said I'd put it in disclaimer. So here's two things that are really bad about jhanas. So those are the good things. Here's some, maybe even more than two. Let's find out. Or this might be like the Spanish Inquisition where I keep adding things that are wrong with it. Number one is that you don't need to do them, right? They're not necessary. And so maybe it's just a big waste of time for you if your goal is just straight up awakening. For some people, some of the time, jhanas are just not necessary at all. I certainly did not do jhana practice and got a long way without it. I do jhana practice now and it's super fun, but it's not necessary. Number two, and you'll see this all the time in Buddhist literature, is that you can get addicted to jhanas in an unhelpful way. Remember how I said they're really fun, really pleasurable? Well, for some people, that pleasure is like, not literally addictive because it is wholesome, but it's like addictive where they just want to go into the jhana and then just stay there. And I'll say there's this really funny thing. If you go into the deepest kind of jhana, it's hard to describe, but it's like your mind is frozen in a block of amber. Like there's just it's just outrageously strange, solid. Your mind feels like a brick, a positive, happy brick, but it's just this solid object. And that's total absorption. And what's really fascinating about that, it's pleasant, but when you come out of it, it's totally obvious. Wow, I could have been in that for 1 minute or 5 days, and it doesn't make any difference because it was so solid, right? So, and this is what most Buddhist teachers would say is like, in a way, just going into jhanas does not bring awakening because there's no possibility of insight. You can't do insight practice when your mind is frozen into a block, and insight practice is how we get awakening. And that's the last thing I will say about the negative, or not negative, but let's say on the con list of the jhanas is that, for most Buddhist teachers, they would say you can't get enlightenment via the jhanas. The enlightenment comes from vipassana. Enlightenment comes from insight. It comes from deconstructing the sense of self. So in a way, they are just booster rockets on your concentration and purification, but they don't do the actual thing of awakening. So there we have it.
So what I hear you saying is you have to do them. There's, I'm just kidding. It's funny. I'm sure there's people going to have a takeaway, be like, okay, I get it. The one thing I have to do is the jhana. So what would you say if someone were basically relatively new to I don't want to say relatively new. People maybe have a little bit of experience. Maybe they have some chops. They can keep their awareness where they'd like it to be for a period of time. What would be your instruction for setting people up for any particular type of jhana that you would suggest people start with? I know you said you can do it with any one of the elements, but what would you suggest as a starting thing for, let's say, the first jhana?
Well, the easiest jhana for most people is breath awareness. That would be very classic. But the way that you do it is not just at the nose. You would do full body breath sensation. So it would be, feel out of breath sensation everywhere in the body. And that's an absorbing enough object, right? Part of a flow state is it has to be complex enough to be gripping, right? And so you contact full body sensation of breath everywhere. And then that would be the standard easy object for going into a jhana.
And I just want to make a note for the folks who are listening. If you weren't here at the beginning, we are actually going to be producing a whole set of guided meditations on Michael's YouTube channel. The link for that is right below. It's an auto-subscribe link, so subscribe, hit the bell icon, and we'll direct you over there. And we're going to be talking about the details, and we'll do a little bit of practice, but mainly we're going to be talking about how. And so we'll make sure that you do have those guidances.
So yeah, that would be an example of a very light jhana, and where you are contacting body sensations of breathing in the way that in a shamatha kind of way. So just I'm sure everyone is aware of the difference between shamatha and vipassana, but just to quickly characterize that. With Vipassana, we're looking into the three characteristics, right? Particularly impermanence and a little bit of no self and suffering, right? We're always seeing how things are changing and falling apart and all that. That's Vipassana. Whereas with Shamatha, we're looking at stability and continuity and softness. That's why Shinzen is always saying that the rest states are more jhana-esque or more shamatha-esque. And in that sense, they really are. So you would be contacting feel out of breathing everywhere in the body, but you would be contacting it not in that deconstructive Shinzen flow impermanence kind of way, but just in this continuous sense of the presence of body sensation of breathing, and particularly the pleasantness of it, the joy of it, the beauty of it.
And so tell me if this would rhyme with what you're saying. A very crude and sort of, let's say crude demonstration here would be, on one hand, if you give a drug reference, so maybe the perfect exact amount of ADD medication to get the whole system perfectly aligned right in a row versus psychedelic material. Is that just so people can have a rough sense of what we're talking about, is that a rough analogy?
I have no idea what you just said, but
exactly.
I mean, let's say we're looking, like right now, I'm looking at a bunch of wild turkeys in a field, which happens to be a really interesting object. And yes, there are wild turkeys in Berkeley. So I'm looking at wild turkeys, and if I notice the impermanence part, it's like, oh, they're continuously moving, they're changing, they're opening their feathers, they're closing their feathers, they're taking baths in dirt, which is really fascinating. And so there's clouds of dirt, the clouds of dirt are moving, the birds are looking around, there's all the continuous flow. But if I look at it in a different way, I'm continuously observing turkeys, right? Continuously observing them being there. And so just by leaning one way or the other, leaning into the shamatha part, it's this continuity. Leaning into the vipassana part, it's how it's continuously changing. Same object. And so with jhana, we would be leaning towards the shamatha aspect of what was happening, this continuous, pleasant joy of breathing. Now, if we were to try harder objects, we would go into deeper jhanas. What makes the objects harder? It's that they become progressively more subtle, progressively more mind objects. And they're mind objects in a way that the Shinzen system doesn't handle quite properly, or quite easily, I should say, because it's not always just image or talk. Sometimes it's, just like you can have we have external talk and mental talk, or external sound and mental talk. You can have body sensations feel out, but rather than feel in being emotion, you can have the mental arising of a body sensation, right? There's no Shinzen label for that. But you see what I mean? Does that make sense?
Sure.
And so Deeper jhanas would be about mental body sensations, and then even deeper ones are basically see in, where there's just these arising of this illumination phenomena, very, very, very subtle, and your mind has to be quite unified and quite still for that to even arise. But if you can start focusing on it, you'll go into complete absorption, and that's where you get this block-like state of mind, which is tremendously cool, by the way.
And just if folks are, just so you know, actually this last few weeks we've been focusing on see-in practice, in particular going in the direction that Michael's talking about, clarifying this experience of the way the mind produces a sense of space, a sense of location, a sense that there's a body below, an environment around. And so if you're here tomorrow, we're actually going to be practicing around that as well.
Yeah, if you ask me, Janusz, see-in practice is the unsung hero of the Shinzen system. Like, you can get more mileage out of see-in practice than almost anything. That leads to stuff like Mahamudra, it leads to stuff, all these non-dual practices, they're all and even the formless jhanas, they're all actually very subtle see-in practices. See-in is amazing.
Yeah, it's really cool. And I've started to actually do it with, brand new people. I was like, do this, focus on this. This is actually very central and much easier than people think. It's really fun practice. So just a plug for see-in. If people don't...
There is a certain 1 out of 100 people have a condition called aphantasia, which means they literally cannot have see-in that they're conscious of.
Well, it's funny that you said it, because I know someone who they think that they have that, and then this is always the trick. I say, okay, close your eyes and point at the door. Like, yeah, it's right over there. It's like, okay, cool. How about, and just even the sense that things are in locations. They're like, yeah, but that's not seeing. And you're like, cool. But we're going to call it seeing. We're going to call it seeing because it's easier than calling it some other weird thing. And it's organized space. You'll notice something close is close to the eyes. Like, it's organized around your eyes.
This is all very true. I can't wait to see what you guys teach about it. I love teaching see-in space practice.
Yeah, super fun.
We're going to go into the first jhana, and we are pretty good at meditating. You have to be, not bad at meditating, or let's say you're in a retreat, but you can do the lightest kind of jhana at home if you're a pretty decent practitioner with a sense of concentration. You would contact these body sensations of breathing, and again, you're contacting them in this way of continuous contact, stable contact, and then you just notice that it feels really good. And so you keep contacting the sensations, and particularly the fact that breathing feels good. And gradually this is going to lead you into, because of course concentrating on something that feels good makes you want to concentrate on it more, which makes it feel better, which makes you want to concentrate on it more, so you're going into this flow state. And this is an interesting thing about jhanas, is you can't force them. It's got to be autocatalytic, like Csikszentmihalyi says in his psychological definition. Remember, in part of the psychological definition is it must be done for its own sake. It has to have a sense of play. You try to force a jhana, it's extremely unpleasant. But you just keep noticing how good it feels to breathe, and you'll start to go into a phase shift. Right? I'm leaving aside access concentration and all that because I see the time here. But, a phase shift occurs, and it's the same phase shift that occurs whenever you get really, really into something. That moment in a movie where it's like you went from sitting in the audience to being inside the film. There's a phase shift that happens there. It draws you in, and suddenly you're in a different place, right? Jhana is like that. You're concentrating, and then you're in the concentration. It's just like something really different has happened, and it's usually characterized by what is called seclusion. And seclusion is like when you're reading a book and you can't hear your mom call your name because you're too focused. you're playing a video game, and there you are, Janusz, you're doing your first person shooter, and you're so involved you don't hear Raquel telling you, to cut it out. So,
I'm sorry, were you just saying something? I was busy.
Exactly.
Battle Royale.
Fallout. Yeah, exactly. So that's seclusion, right? You get so involved that the other senses start dropping out. The other senses go to rest. And so there's this moment where you're just concentrated, and then it just draws you in, and now you're secluded. You're just with just that. Now, probably all of us have felt that in meditation. That's like that feeling, oh, I was in the zone. And remember, in the zone is just colloquial English for a flow state. And flow state is, a much more general definition of a jhana. So you get in the zone with your practice. What are the jhana factors? Well, that's a whole other discussion. We're going to get into the technical part of jhana. I'm happy to do that, maybe in the Q&A here. But basically, what I want to say is jhanas are fascinating and fun. And like most things that are fascinating and fun, they're totally unnecessary. You do not have to do them. You can achieve all your, meditation goals without them. And at the same time, if you are into it, they can be super fun, super interesting, and also really powerful. Really powerful. So.
Yeah, and actually what you just said there about not needing to do them, it's interesting because I think at some point we get into a little bit of a semantic game, and there's this, the metaphor of the wise men and the elephant, where people have their absolute, definite, personal, direct knowledge of the only way to solve a certain problem, and they tell people this is the only one true way. And I think that part of what we've probably both absorbed from Shinzen is to recognize that if people are doing a practice seriously for any period of time, the likelihood is it's working for them. And so to try to see it from the fact that, okay, maybe it is working for them, even if it doesn't make any sense to me. But this relates to something someone brought up in the chat, total gauntlet thrown down. There's a quote here that says, there is no insight without jhana. And I remember when I was sitting with Bhante Gunaratana, he used to say, jhana, and it was funny, it was a jhana retreat, but it's like, yeah, it's basically just get a little, concentration and we'll go to insight. But they were selling it as a jhana retreat because people, they like the jhanas, or they like the title, they want to know what it is, they're curious. But basically he would say, jhana is insight, insight is jhana. He would also say that heart practice, metta, is insight, and insight is metta. And I think part of that is, and tell me if this is incorrect, but it's partially the awakening that you optimize for is the one that you get, or what are your thoughts on the relationship there between those two ideas?
Boy, that's a big question. I'll say, first of all, anyone who throws a quote at me, thank you. I love quotes. I'm into, historical texts. I like foreign languages. My degrees are in literature. Great, throw a quote at me. But if you know anything about, the history of Indian religion, you can find an equal and opposite quote for anything, right? You could just play that game all day long. And in that particular quote, there's no insight without jhana. Yeah, what do they mean? Which jhana? Are they talking about the jhanas, or do they just mean meditation? Because if they say there's no insight without meditation, okay, so sure, you can get as rigid or as unrigid as you want with whatever definition. It's kind of an uninteresting thing to do. We are here as meditation grad students, which means we want to be informed and understand that there's an extremely wide spectrum of possibility. This is the gift of Shinzen, is that he started out as a Buddhist studies PhD major, right? So he was reading the widest possible literature and comparing and contrasting. And this is a really fascinating way to work. And in fact, it's a way that we have to work, I think, to be informed and non-dogmatic practitioners, so there's that. Another thing is that insight and jhana exist along a spectrum. You know, they are always contrasted as somehow totally different, but actually, of course, it's a spectrum, not a binary. And there's a theoretical place right exactly between jhana and vipassana, right? Where you're, let's say, either kind of noticing the change or noticing both stability and instability. There's so many possibilities there about what that means. Then I'm going to say something really just like cynical realpolitik here, just as a capper, and that is, remember that the Buddha learned the jhanas from Hindus. And insight is the thing he invented. And so you get two things there. One, and this is for people who say that, you know, Vipassana is the only way to get enlightened. I'm making the opposite point. I'm like arguing for the jhanas now. You know, people who say insight is the only way to get enlightened, remember that they're saying, well, the Buddha's original IP is the one that counts. You know, it's his intellectual property is the one true way to liberation. And it's like, well, I wonder how politically motivated that is actually. And the other thing is that, look, with the Mahasi system, they threw out the jhanas altogether, and plenty of people get super enlightened doing Mahasi noting, like U-Ba Khin and Goenka and all those guys. It's a super powerful way to just skip the jhana. So we have actual proof that that quote is limited if we start, you know, interpreting it too strongly or too narrowly.
Yeah, and I think that's something that, you know, we both know is part of Shinzen's history, is he didn't believe any of it was true or real, and he went there just sort of to study it, went to Asia to sort of study this weird cultural quirk and realized, oh, you can do this stuff, and then realized that there's just all these people will butt heads day in and day out, but people who actually do the work are just trying to figure out the language so they can be like, yeah, we're both on the same page here. Unless, you know, there's that classic provincial thing where people are trying to say like, oh, you're not as awakened as me, or you're not, you know, people sort of tussling in that way. But generally, the people who have the experience have more awareness of how to talk about this material, or at least how to approach it, and how it's pretty flexible. Isn't it the Ken Wilber quote where he's like, what does he say? He's like, this isn't democracy. You don't get to have an opinion. He's like, go stare at the wall for 5 years and tell me about emptiness.
Hilarious.
Yeah.
You know, the other thing I was going to say is that another thing that happens with Buddhist teachers is they will then say that, no, the Brahmins did not teach Buddha the jhanas. They taught him jhana-like practices, but the Buddha made them original Buddhism, right? And in the long run, this is just not interesting. I mean, it's fascinating as a phenomenon, but it's not going to help you in your meditation. What helps you in your meditation is to do the work.
Yeah.
And just to commit to a path that you think will work for you, and give it a shot.
Yeah. With all of these claims, I like to just think about, is this something that would support someone fortifying their own sort of themselves as being the central, you know, knowledge point for this material? Because there's always the two things that teachers say. There is only one true path, if they say it explicitly or not. And I happen to teach it, which is very lucky. Because if there was one true path and I didn't happen to teach it, well, you wouldn't want to be donating your money here or that kind of thing.
The true path, the original path, the only path.
Better path.
You know, better path, all that. Faster. Path,
yeah.
All of that.
Wonderful. So
as meditation grad students, let's just be really clear always that everyone claims to know the one true way. And we could just set that aside and start to look at what's fun, what works, what are the upsides of each practice, what are the downsides of each practice, and start to get a much more nuanced, grayscale view of the field.
Yeah. Perfect. Let's jump into some questions here. So we have one question here from the R Stream Entry subreddit. If folks don't know, it's a great little
favorite subreddit. I love it. I love our stream entry.
Yeah, it's super fun. Yeah, if folks don't know, it's a nice little subreddit where people are talking about awakening in a really straightforward way. Very supportive, loving. We love those folks. We did an AMA with Shinzen with them. We're both members.
It's basically a pragmatic Dharma subreddit. So you get Shinzen there, you get Daniel, you get Chuladasa, you get Ken Fold, those kind of people.
And it has a sort of Reddit air where people are just, I don't know, just I like the vibe. As far as running runner's high and body euphoria, is that on the spectrum of PT therefore useful to bring the mind towards awareness of PT? And I think you said earlier that there's a relationship with flow states. And I was curious if also on an extension of this, if there's a relationship between really getting into those flow states and what we describe as access concentration.
Yeah, I mean, access concentration is an early flow state, right? It's not quite a flow state yet. It might not have the jhana factors to quite the same degree, but they're there. In terms of PT, so this is a Pali word translated as rapture, and it's like these Kundalini type sensations, but they're also weirdly mental. There's like this showering sensation or flashing kind of, I forget what they call it. It's like starbursts in your body of frisson, you know? And yeah, so the same stuff that comes up when you are so involved in a piece of music that it's not just that it's emotionally uplifting, but it also you start getting like your hair standing on end and kind of like electric shocks. That's PT. And in fact, for some people, some of the time, PT can be quite intense. And in fact, this is why we haven't talked about this yet, but you know, there's jhana 1, 2, 3, 4. The reason you would want to move from jhana 1 to jhana 2 is not necessarily that it's deeper, although in one sense it is, but it's that the PT in jhana 1 ends up being kind of exhausting. It's like, to put it in a weird metaphor, it's like if someone asked you to be on the edge of an orgasm for a long time, that might be cool for a while, but after a while it might get really uncomfortable, even though it's pleasant. And so that's not a perfect metaphor, but it's the same idea where something that's pleasurable can end up kind of being uncomfortable. And for some people, the PT is so intense, it's quite uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And so in all the classic literature, you want to move to jhana 2 because the body shock, Kundalini stuff dies down, and the joy of the meditation grows. Right?
Yeah.
It's quite a bit bigger. That's not the only difference between jhana 1 and 2, but that's a big one. It's much easier and more pleasant. It's almost a relief to move into jhana 2 after jhana 1, even though jhana 1 at first is like the coolest possible thing.
Yeah, I remember early in my meditation days contacting I was like, I'm going to contact Lee Brasington, and he amazingly wrote back, and I was like, so I'm doing this thing, cultivating PT, but it feels a little like my hands are on fire, more like I'm being electrocuted. What do you suggest? And he's like, stop what you're doing, spread out the PT, have greater awareness of the entire body. And I thought I was moving forward because I was having more and more intense, blazing hot, painful, vibratory sensation.
And I just want to give a plug for Lee. He's here in Oakland where I live. He's a good friend of mine. That guy knows his shit. If you want to learn about jhanas, he is amazingly good at it. He's been teaching it for decades.
Excellent. So let's see.
His book on the jhanas is wonderful.
Excellent. Pam is asking, is there any short meditation that we're going to be doing today?
We're not going to be doing one here on the video stream. I described it, but to actually sit and do it would take an hour, probably. So,
well, let me ask,
Janusz, you really want me to guide a short thing? I would say, come and do a full version of it with me, or you can find already existing videos.
Yeah. I'm going to encourage folks now, we'll keep going here, but I'm going to encourage folks to head to his channel on a separate tab so you don't lose us here. hit the subscribe and hit the bell icon, because we're actually going to be having these meditations on that channel coming soon. You won't know when they hit unless you have that bell struck, or you can just check back every day obsessively like I do, and you'll find out all about it. Okay, so we decided today, since it's such a rich topic, that we wanted to make sure we get a good thorough description, get some questions answered, and leave time for the practice on Michael's channel. Okay, it seems possible to cause PT to arise with a bit of effort. Does this help deepen into hard jhana over time? And there's also a bit of a discussion on our stream entry about the difference between hard jhana and soft jhana. There seemed to be a pejorative relationship there, that hard jhana was the real stuff to some degree. I heard that in there. I don't know if that was explicit or if that was just my imagination.
Okay, well, as I said, there's the jhana wars, right? And the jhana wars exist because the jhanas 1, 2, 3, 4 are described in terms of factors in the scriptures. They're not described in terms of depth. And so over the centuries, different teachers and different manuals like, Vishuddhimagga and Satipatthana and all that, describe the depths of the jhanas differently. And so you can get everything from a very light jhana, which is the one I'm describing you do on body sensations of breathing, to like a mid-range jhana, which is what Lee Brazenton teaches. It's really cool, where you're just meditating on the pleasure, all the way to the hardest, deepest type of jhana, which is that illumination phenomena where your mind turns into a brick. That is deep jhana, and it's cool, but you need some serious chops and some long practice to do that, and usually a long time in a retreat. And I just want to get into some of the texts. So if we kind of lay it out in a line, you can find pretty good light medium jhanas in the Lee Brazenton book. I think it's called Right Concentration. He describes it very well. It's an awesome book. Get it. If you want the hardest, absolutely most difficult kind of jhana, that's the Ajahn Brahm book, Mindfulness and Beyond, or something like that. I can't think of the name of it, but it's Ajahn Brahm's jhana book. And he will claim that that's the most religious view, like the jhanas are the only way, and only these deepest things count as jhanas, and so on. So it's he kind of takes the furthest position on the extreme scale. However, it's a great book about how to go into these really deep jhanas, right? So we want that one on our shelf too. A third one is Daniel Ingram's book, Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha. He'll go way into the jhanas. He's a jhana master. He's great at it. He's wonderful at teaching them. And he has the additional feature in there of talking a lot about Vipassana jhanas. Oh my God, I said it. Opening that whole can of worms, but he talks about that really interesting topic at length. And he also talks about fire kasina jhana. So working particularly with fire kasina and other elemental kasinas to go into jhana. And the last and final book I'll just go back to is The Mind Illuminated Again, which has in the book the different depths of jhana. So he'll show you how to do a very light jhana, the body sensations of breathing. He calls it light, I'll call it a medium jhana, which is you do it on the pleasure. And then he also shows you how to go into the deepest kind, the illuminated jhana. So all of these, to me, all of these are just a spectrum of depth of concentration, right? They're all jhanas. They count as jhanas because they have the jhana factors. But we're talking about a totally separate dimension of how concentrated they are. And so we can solve the jhana wars instantly about what's a real jhana and what's not is, does it have the jhana factors or not? If it does, it's a jhana. But guess what? That's a separate dimension from how deep it is. And once we add that separate dimension of depth, then we get this very light, medium, super deep jhana thing. And, for anyone to claim this is the real one based on the depth, well, that's just your opinion. That's the hour.
Perfect. Okay, so we have another question here from John. Do you think the development of PT is the purifying aspect of jhana? And it might be helpful to mention that there are a few different definitions of PT as well, that people talk about that differently.
Yeah, and in the earlier question, they were talking about trying on purpose to develop PT. You know, you can work with PT, and it's true, you can make it stronger or weaker on purpose. But jhana, remember, is effortless in the end. You have to make the effort to meditate, but in the meditation, it's about getting absorbed in the wonder of it, absorbed. You know, if you want jhana to go faster, notice how beautiful the meditation object is. Notice how much joy there is. Don't sit there trying to force it and make it harder and stronger. That's just the wrong mood entirely. Come back over and over again outside of the meditation to this image of the young boy Buddha sitting on the banks of a river, kind of hanging out in a beautiful afternoon under a tree. He's not trying to force anything, right? So pushing the PT and all that, it's not that you can't do that, but in the long run, it's the wrong mood. Jhana and even flow states, any kind of absorption, is about effortless wonder, effortless absorption in the play of the activity. And that is the crucial point.
That's awesome. Super helpful. We have another question here coming in from RPS. RPS, thanks for joining. Curious where you're coming from, RPS. I don't think we have your location, but thanks for joining. What kind of time investment is the average practitioner going to need in order to get into jhana? I've heard from some people that it's totally realistic. You talked a little bit about this before with your levels of depth of jhana, and also that some practitioners are wired for it and some aren't.
Yeah, and so based that there's levels of depth, based that some people are just naturally good at it, there's just no average anything. But it is, I will say, for most people, most of the time, especially the light jhanas, very achievable. I mean, you just want to be able to be good and concentrated, right? So if you're good and concentrated and you start and you bust out like Lee Brasington's book and you really start working with the instructions, you'll be able to get into a jhana eventually. It's just not that hard. The people who have the hardest time have a lot of purification to do. So there's, in other words, you know, that's Buddhist code for they have issues. So either there's just too much distraction in life, or there's too much psychological material bubbling up, and so you got to work that through. And if you work it through, usually, you know, someone like Lee would say, work it through doing metta. I might say, yeah, metta and a bunch of trips to the psychotherapist or whatever. But that's the kind of stuff that gets in the way. Why does it get in the way? Because if you are suppressing a lot of material all day, there's stuff you just don't want to think about. When you try to go into a jhana, all that will bubble up, right? So it's just what Shinzen calls purification. You need a certain level of purification of mind to be able to be that concentrated. Because otherwise, all your issues start unpacking while you're sitting there.
Great.
It's jhana hard. Good for Vipassana, though. You can do Vipassana on those issues like crazy.
And that's, I think, a few questions that are leading into that. Patrick, welcome, Patrick. Great to see you here.
Just a second. My AirPods are about to die, so I'm going to switch AirPods.
Oh, sweet.
I've got 2 sets.
Yeah, exactly. You need at least 2. You need 2 or 3. I try to just have a whole bucket we can talk about.
I'm thinking that the modern meditation teacher has at least 3 sets of AirPods.
Yeah, exactly.
So this is crucial.
Exactly.
It's not real unless it's 3.
Yeah, I
sets, no, you're not real.
Exactly. Have you seen the earpods meme where people are talking about like they don't? It's like, I'm sorry, I don't speak poor. What are you saying?
Yeah, I don't even want to tell you how much I'm judging you about the fact that you have poor.
I know, it's like, it's really, listen, hey, that's why if people, you know, send in super chats to this stream, we're gonna get some gold-plated earpods. That's actually what we're going to invest in, and we're not going to invest it in ways to improve our videos. Okay, a bunch of great questions. Patrick here is asking, what about helpfulness in insight practice in terms of jhana? Is jhana useful to learn as a way to get collected quickly and more easily, to amp up practice efficiency?
Well, I mean, in one sense, yes, right? Like, just in the most basic way of putting it, that's what jhana's for, is to like boost your practice, your level of concentration, your level of purity, your level of absorption, so that you then shred in your vipassana, right? If your mind's that concentrated, you then lean out of the shamatha into the vipassana. You're looking at the three characteristics, and it's like, blah, 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 blah. You know, you're just super concentrated. And so it makes for, you know, absolutely walloping vipassana, which is why you would do it at all. That is the point. On the other hand, you can just develop walloping vipassana on its own. And it might be faster. It just depends on who you are and your proclivities. So that's why I'm reluctant to say it's the most efficient way. Some people just are really good at vipassana.
Yeah. And that actually brings me to another question, is that people, this is my own question, people often talk about this practice or that practice being the best as far as being able to practice all the time. So as far as if you're having to pick between one or the other and somebody wants to be practicing all throughout their daily life, what would you suggest in terms of a direction?
Well, I mean, by definition, jhana is not something you do all day long.
Right.
You know, if we're talking about the jhanas, part of the definition I gave was that you do it in a meditative context, meaning sitting meditation. Vipassana is, of course, something you can take with you all day long. Now, that being said, of course, you can meditate in a shamatha way a lot during the day. And it's possible, if you are really good at jhanas, you could, you know, just sit in your car and close your eyes and go into a jhana pretty fast for 5 minutes before, like, going into the store or whatever. But that's just not, you know, that's like kind of post-stream entry stuff. So it might not be what they're asking for.
Right.
Or what you're asking for. You
Right.
know what I mean? It's like, if what we're talking about is kind of getting over the stream entry finish line quickest, which I just, even that whole way of thinking is just inside out and upside down. But if we're talking about that, the answer is a very solid and clear, sharp, it depends.
Exactly.
Depends on a lot of factors.
Exactly. Okay. Someone else here asked, could the entire jhanas 1 through 4, which keep in mind, folks, we're talking about doing another set where we'll be talking about the other side of the jhanas, the formless jhanas. Could jhanas 1 through 4...
Which aren't even jhanas.
Which aren't even jhanas. Exactly. Well, we're throwing down a gauntlet. Exactly. So, so jhanas 1 through 4, could they be taught using unified mindfulness language only? That's a question from Zeroneth, who I think is bringing in some chats over from the subreddit r/stream entry, I believe.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, it depends on how wide your vocabulary list for UM is, you know. Like, does UM have a word for piti and sukha? Does UM have a word for, you know, that really means seclusion and stuff? Of course, Shinzen knows all those words. And so in that sense, yeah, it's part of UM. I just don't know if it's part of the standard training these days. You could probably, I mean, people go into jhanas anyway. Just the Buddha went into one when he was a kid, sitting on the banks of a river, and it wasn't just because he was the Buddha. So you can go into a jhana in a meditative context all the damn time and not even know that's what it's called. You might just be saying, wow, I just had a really good sit. So yes, you can teach it in UM, but you might either have to use the Pali words or use some special English words to kind of get to get some of the very specific points correct.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth mentioning that if folks don't know, unified mindfulness is not only the system that Shinzen uses to help people understand a lot of this material, a lot of meditation material in general, but also it it's the premise of it is actually unified. It can span everything. So a beginning unified mindfulness teacher is going to have, a few bits and pieces of information that will be very useful for a lot of people. And then over time, the premise is you actually bring your own creative flow into it, and you can use whatever you want. It's a very expansive system. So I would personally say that Michael in general is teaching straight up UM. He's just doing the advanced version.
Yeah, as Shinzen always says, bring the added value, right? Here's the UM, but it's open to whatever edition, so you add the value. And so, sure, if we, add in a bunch of Jhana vocabulary, great. Then we're using standard UM.
Yeah. And it's also, as far as I know, if people know otherwise, it's definitely the most creative, dynamic, stretchy system that I could imagine, because you can sort of do whatever you want.
Are you saying it's the best and the original?
Well, no, I obviously, this is the thing. Like I said, every teacher says this to some degree. There is one true teaching. I happen to teach it. You can't not help but do that. Hopefully I have at least a tiny bit of reflection to say, yes, and my system has all these giant flaws. But for me, as a teacher, the flexibility is super fun and super awesome, and I prefer it to be very creative than very do this one thing or you're out.
Absolutely.
So Michael, we're reaching the end of your time. I don't want to stress your time budget here. So I just want to say, as we're beginning to wrap up, we might be going on a couple more minutes. If people have not yet gone to Michael's channel, please do so. Hit that subscribe button, hit that bell icon. Look out for the meditations, which will be coming down the pike soon. Any thoughts for folks?
This is a fascinating topic. Try it out, and if you're into it, there is a tremendous amount of great material. All the books I mentioned, plus a whole bunch more. Read them. See the big spectrum, the wide spectrum of viewpoints and techniques, and then start working at the place that makes sense to you. If you like this stuff, it's a blast. If you're not into it, that's cool. So thanks, Janusz. It's been super fun. I'm so happy you set this up, and sorry to everyone whose questions we haven't had time to get to. I really appreciate you being here.
Just a quick programming note, Michael had to leave the stream at this point, but we were able to answer all of the questions, which is coming up next. Well, thank you so much, and it's always a pleasure to have you here. We'll hopefully have you at some point in the future.
Thanks, everybody. Talk to you soon.
Tomorrow we're actually going to be having a Dharma diagnosis with a friend who is on the stream right now. Lewis is going to be joining us after the meditation, and we're going to be doing a little Dharma diagnosis. In fact, we have a question right here from Lewis. Can any object be used for jhana? There are sensations, mind objects, kasina, and I've heard Janusz talk about jhana practice in the bond of the relationship. Do these lead to the same place? So again, I wish I could hear Michael's perspective on this. I can only give you mine. My experience is limited to my own personal experience. That's how that works. Many things can be used as objects for jhana, and hypothetically, I could say maybe everything could be, but I actually don't. I think that that's canonically not correct, and typically it has to be something that, A, Michael mentioned, is wholesome, and B, the system can stabilize around. So there are things that, especially for newer meditators, et cetera, are too unstable, are too dynamic for that experience to work. For instance, qualities of flow from Shinzen's perspective, the movement quality of the body, the changing quality, that kind of thing. Those things I think could be very difficult to practice on and lead to the same place. I think is a little bit of a question. The idea that anything leads to the same place is a little bit questionable, although there are some similarities and there's some general characteristics you can talk about. I like to really think of it from a personal perspective that yes, there are sort of directions, but individuals are always going to bring their own proclivities, their own interest, this kind of thing to any of these places. And we talked about using the relationship, the bond in the relationship as the object of meditation. That would definitely be in the realm of a light jhana. But basically it's looking at the connection experience and using that as the object of meditation and kind of reveling in that, and that could be very good for developing relationships and connection. For instance, right now we have been on this live stream for this long, we have this little bit more connection than we did at the beginning of the live stream, and if you can detect that as an experience, it's a bit of a mental formation. It's a combination of mental image, mental audio, some emotional experience, maybe some body sensation, and noticing what that is like, what the feeling of feeling a little more bonded is, connected with each other. And that can be the object of meditation. Of course, with a lot of dynamism, if you're talking or that kind of thing, it can be a little harder, but you can actually be checking in on that. It would be hard to move into jhana while in conversation. Metamucil asks, how do we spread piti out in the body? That's a great question. Mostly it's concentrated in the face and hands for me. Metamucil, that is my exact experience too. I had to learn how to spread piti out, and it's very fascinating. So supposing you have piti in the body, you have piti you notice in the hands, there's this very interesting quality. And when I first started doing it, I had this sudden realization. I was like, oh man, I'm moving energy around in my body. That sounds very woo-woo, and that is not what I had planned on. So just know that this does get a little bit woo-woo. But basically, if you're paying attention to the sensations of piti in any particular part of the body, you can hold awareness in a larger part of the body. So if you feel it just in your hands, holding awareness in a broader spectrum, but not having this sense that there's no piti there. You're sort of telling the mind, feel the piti over here, and you just allow it to be there and allow it to be there. And at some point, it'll start to just detect these kind of tingles, these little bits of piti, and the piti will start to spread out. And actually, you want it to spread out as much as possible. Look for it in all sorts of different experiences. Typically, anything where there's any exertion, like the top of the in-breath, the end of the out-breath, there's a little bit of this sort of light effervescent quality there, but the mind is usually drawn to the more intense quality, so it doesn't notice the piti. But at some point, you can actually notice that piti can be there all throughout your body. A runner's high is actually a really excellent example of that. Zaraneth says, could the jhanas be purely taught in the UM system using their language? Is this the same question we asked before? Would it be defined as something, a kind of mixture of feel rest and feel good? That's a pretty good estimation of how I would approach it if I were trying to guide folks. But it's helpful to know, though, that the UM system is a kind of periodic table of all of the meditation elements. And once you know it, and once you can dynamically move through all of this material, you can go in any direction you want, and that's what we were talking about before. So know that it's really very flexible in that way. You know, come to think of it, we actually have a bunch of great teachers coming on here soon to do collaborations and interviews and a bunch of other content. So if you'd like, you could actually subscribe here and hit the bell icon if you want to keep up on that. I'm actually going to go right to Michael's channel right now and just see what there is to be seen here. Oh, let's watch this.